The truck came on a Monday morning before the frost had even burned off the grass. One truck, unmarked, backing carefully up the gravel drive of a falling-down sheep farm outside a town so small the gas station doubled as the post office. The driver didn't say much. He just opened the trailer gate and let bale after bale of raw wool tumble out onto the mud, 40 of them, matted and yellowed, some still tangled with burrs and bits of straw. Neighbors driving past on their way to work slowed down to look. A few shook their heads because everybody in that county knew what that wool was. Reject stock. The kind no mill wanted, no buyer would touch. The kind that usually got burned in a pit behind the processing plant because burning was cheaper than storing it. So when people saw those bales piling up behind a broken-down farmhouse, they asked the obvious question. Why would anyone want wool nobody else would take? And when they found out who had asked for it, the question got stranger. Because the woman standing at the end of that driveway, arms crossed watching the last bale hit the mud, wasn't a rancher, wasn't a textile worker, had never so much as owned a knitting needle in her life. She was 31 years old, a single mother of 2, and 6 months earlier she had been folding towels at a laundromat to make rent. She'd asked the mill for more bales than they'd offered, not fewer, more. The mill's own foreman pulled her aside before he left and told her something she'd remember for a long time, though not for the reason he meant. He told her this wool was garbage, second cut and full of contamination, the kind nobody in their right mind paid for. She thanked him for the warning. Then she asked when the next truck could come. If you believe the things people call worthless are usually just waiting for someone patient enough to look closer, stick around. This one's worth the whole story. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always want to know how far these stories travel. Her name was Renata Kovac, and until that spring she had never given wool a second thought. She'd grown up in a rented duplex 2 towns over, raised by a mother who cleaned houses and a father who mostly wasn't around. She'd married young, had her son Milo at 22 and her daughter Ivy at 25, and by the time the marriage ended, she was left with 2 kids, a car that needed a transmission, and a job that paid just enough to keep the lights on and nothing else. What she also had, tucked in a shoebox from her grandmother's estate, was a deed nobody in the family had ever mentioned. 9 acres outside town, a collapsed barn, and a farmhouse with a hole in the roof you could see daylight through. Her grandmother had run a small flock of sheep on it decades back. Before arthritis and then age took the work out of her hands, she'd never sold it. Just paid the taxes quietly for 30 years and let it sit. Folded inside the deed, in her grandmother's handwriting, was a single line that meant nothing to Renata at the time. Nothing that looks like much is ever really nothing. She didn't understand it. She'd turn it over in her mind for the rest of the year, the way you keep touching a bruise to see if it still hurts, and it wouldn't make sense, until the very end of this story, when she'd realize her grandmother hadn't been talking about the land at all. At the time, she was 3 months behind on the duplex, staring at a deed to 9 acres of ruin that seemed like exactly the kind of nothing her family always seemed to inherit. A cousin offered to buy the land for $8,000 just to be rid of the tax bill. She almost said yes, but that line in her grandmother's handwriting kept catching in her throat every time she tried to sign, so instead of selling, she drove out one Saturday with the kids asleep in the back seat to look at what she actually owned. It was worse than she expected. The barn had half collapsed under snow load years back. The fencing was down in every direction. But there was also an extension office 40 minutes away, and inside it, a woman named Dolores Ferris, who had spent nearly 3 decades advising small fiber farms exactly like the one Renata's grandmother had run into the ground. Renata walked in with a folder of photos and a question she felt foolish asking. Could this land be worth anything to anyone again? Dolores didn't laugh, which Renata appreciated, but she didn't sugarcoat it either. She said restoring the barn alone would cost more than Renata likely had, that the fencing, the water lines, the shearing equipment, all of it gone or ruined, would eat any savings twice over. If Renata wanted income off that land, she said, leasing it for hay would be faster and far less painful than trying to raise sheep again. Then, almost as an afterthought, Dolores mentioned that a lot of small mills in the region were sitting on huge amounts of reject wool they couldn't legally dump and couldn't afford to keep. Contaminated batches, off-color runs, wool that failed grading for reasons that had nothing to do with whether it could still be useful. Some of it, she said, was honestly fine wool. Just wool nobody wanted to deal with. Renata didn't think much of the comment walking out. It came back to her 3 weeks later, at 2 in the morning, while she was folding someone else's laundry and doing the math on rent for the 4th time that night. That's what led her to call the Baldrick Mill, 90 minutes north, and to roughly 6,000 pounds of raw wool nobody wanted. The reason was ordinary, almost boring. The mill had taken on contract for a specialty yarn buyer that fell through at the last minute, leaving them with an entire season second-cut fleece. Wool sheared a second time from the same animals, shorter and coarser than prime fleece, and mixed in with a batch that had picked up vegetable matter and staining nobody could fully sort out. None of it met grading standards for commercial yarn buyers. Legally, they couldn't just burn it without a permit, and the storage costs were eating into margins every week it sat there. When Renata called asking to take some off their hands for free, the mill's operations manager, a clipped, no-nonsense woman named Frances Whitlow, was almost suspicious. Nobody asked for reject stock. Certainly nobody asked for more of it than was on offer. But Frances had been in the wool business long enough to know that contaminated, mixed-grade fleece wasn't automatically garbage. It just wasn't sellable the way it sat. If Renata wanted to sort, clean, and process it herself, that was Renata's problem, not the mill's. Frances agreed, mostly because it solved her own disposal headache, and because she privately figured the whole idea would collapse before the first bale was even carted. That was the deal that brought one unmarked truck down a gravel road and a line of curious neighbors who slowed just enough to watch a woman they were sure was making a mistake. The first weeks nearly proved them right. Renata had cleared space in the half-standing barn and borrowed a rusted-out picking table from Dolores's office. But she hadn't accounted for how much raw lanolin grease clung to unwashed fleece, how it would clog every tool she touched, or how badly 6,000 pounds of wool could smell after sitting damp for even a few days. Within a week, mold had crept into 3 of the bales she hadn't gotten to fast enough, and she lost nearly 400 pounds before she understood that raw wool needed to be dried and skirted almost immediately, not stored the way she'd assumed. Dolores, when Renata called in a panic, didn't say "I told you so." She drove out that same afternoon and showed her how to build simple drying racks out of pallet wood and chicken wire, cheap enough to build a dozen of them in a weekend. So no fleece sat wet longer than a day. It cost Renata almost nothing but time. It also saved what was left of the batch. Then came the scouring problem. Washing raw wool at scale wasn't like washing a sweater. Too much agitation and the fibers felt it into a ruined, tangled mass right in the wash water. An entire batch gone in 20 minutes, because Renata hadn't understood that wool fibers lock together permanently under heat and friction if you're not careful. She lost a second batch that way before Dolores taught her to control water temperature and handle the fleece gently, almost lazily, letting the dirt and grease release instead of forcing it. Then came the moths. Nobody warns you about the moths. A pair of barn windows she hadn't sealed properly let them in, and they found the driest, most protected bales irresistible, until she learned to store finished fiber in sealed totes with cedar blocks, an ugly, unglamorous fix that worked better than anything expensive would have. Just when she thought the worst of it was behind her, a different kind of problem showed up, one that had nothing to do with wool at all. Propane prices spiked that winter, driven by a regional shortage that had nothing to do with her operation and everything to do with markets she'd never thought to watch. Heating the barn for drying and processing suddenly cost nearly double what she'd budgeted. For a few weeks she considered skipping the heat entirely and drying fleece the slow way, in open air, a shortcut Dolores warned her against the moment she mentioned it. Fleece that dries too slowly in cold, damp air doesn't just take longer, Dolores told her. It mildews from the inside before you ever see it on the surface, and any savings on propane gets erased twice over in ruined wool. Instead, Renata renegotiated with a local propane supplier, willing to lock in a winter rate if she committed to a full-season contract. A decision that meant less flexibility, but steadier costs she could actually plan around. Each failure taught her something the last one hadn't. She learned to judge fleece by feel, catching brittleness that meant a sheep had been stressed or malnourished. She learned that staining could sometimes be washed out entirely, while true felting damage couldn't be fixed at any price, and to test small batches before committing an entire lot. By late winter, Renata had lost nearly a third of her original 6,000 pounds to mistakes. But she still had thousands of pounds of clean, workable fiber, and for the first time, something that actually looked like it might become a product. Her first sale was almost accidental. A neighbor who'd mocked the whole operation from her porch asked, half joking, whether Renata had anything soft enough for a baby blanket yet. Renata sold her a small batch of hand-carded batting for $20, wrapped in brown paper at her kitchen table. By the next week, the neighbor had told 2 friends. Word moved slowly at first. A booth at the county craft fair, a phone call from a fiber shop 2 towns over, but it moved. The real turn came when a woman named Priscilla Aldine drove out after hearing that Renata's felted dryer balls were better than anything she'd stocked before. Priscilla ran a well-regarded home goods shop, the kind of store that cared where its products came from. She didn't want charity, she wanted consistency. Same weight, same quality, every single order. That single requirement forced Renata into the hardest lesson of her first year, grading. Because she'd started with mixed, contaminated stock, her batches varied wildly, some soft and clean, others coarse and still faintly stained. A shop like Priscilla's wouldn't tolerate a box of felted goods with 3 different qualities mixed in. Renata had to learn to sort fiber by grade at every stage, setting aside the roughest wool for insulation, batting, and rug work, saving the softest for anything that would touch skin. She failed Priscilla's order twice before she got it right. Priscilla almost walked away the second time, but Renata drove out in person, admitted the mistake without excuses, and asked for one more chance with a smaller order she could guarantee. Priscilla gave it to her. It became a standing monthly account. From there, growth came the way growth actually comes. Slower than the version people imagine, faster than doing nothing. Craft fair regulars turned into 2 more shop accounts. Each new account brought its own small, unglamorous lesson. One buyer wanted felted dryer balls packaged and labeled by hand, which meant learning basic branding on a kitchen table budget. Another wanted wholesale invoicing and volume commitments Renata had never had to think about when she was selling out of a cardboard box at a craft fair. A regional distributor heard about her felted insulation panels, a niche product born almost by accident, after Dolores mentioned that coarse reject wool made excellent natural insulation, and offered a contract that terrified her with its volume requirements. More wool than one barn could reliably process. That forced her hardest decision yet, expand or stay small. She took out a loan she hated taking, rebuilt the barn's second half, and hired her first employee, a laid-off mill worker named Coral, who understood grading better than Renata did, and taught her as much as Dolores ever had. Mold hit again that second winter, a bad batch that swept through one storage section before Renata and Coral caught it early, thanks to a habit Renata had built without realizing it. Walking the drying racks every single morning, checking for anything that smelled or felt wrong. She'd learned that the earliest sign of trouble was almost never dramatic. It was just fiber acting slightly off. She survived that scare with losses instead of collapse, because she'd learned to see problems before they became disasters. By the second year, Renata had added a small finishing room, a simple felting machine bought secondhand, and a basic labeling setup that let her sell not just raw batting but finished dryer balls, rug yarn, and insulation panels to specialty buyers, tripling her margin on fiber that would have otherwise gone for almost nothing. She learned the unglamorous mechanics of a real fiber business, wholesale terms, the brutal math of shipping weight versus price, how one missed delivery could cost her an account she'd spent a year building. She crossed 6 figures in revenue near the end of that second year. Not with one dramatic sale, but with the quiet accumulation of accounts, a reputation, and a barn that had gone from half collapse to humming with work. Nobody in the county thought she'd ever finish. Francis Whitlow, the mill manager who'd once been suspicious of her request, became one of her steadiest suppliers, sending Renata the same kind of contaminated, mixed-grade fleece other buyers rejected, because she was the only processor in 3 counties who knew what to do with it. Late one evening, folding fresh batting at her kitchen table, with Milo doing homework across from her and Ivy asleep upstairs, Renata finally understood her grandmother's note. She hadn't meant the land. She'd meant Renata herself. All the years Renata had assumed she was just getting by, just surviving, ordinary in a family that specialized in quietly inheriting things that looked like nothing. Her grandmother had seen something in her, long before Renata saw it in herself. The land was never the inheritance. The willingness to notice value where everyone else saw waste. That was what she'd actually left her. The trucks still come sometimes, dropping off fiber other buyers won't touch. Renata still walks the drying racks every morning before the kids wake up, checking the fleece the way her grandmother once checked her flock. Not for what it obviously was, but for what it could still become. Nobody in that county laughs anymore when a truck backs down toward her barn. They just watch the same way they always did, except now they're waiting to see what she'll build next. What this story leaves you with isn't a formula for getting rich off rejected wool. It's simpler than that, and harder. Most opportunity doesn't arrive looking like opportunity. It arrives looking like a mess. Something somebody else already gave up on. The people who succeed aren't the ones with the most resources or the most obvious talent. They're the ones patient enough to sit with something broken long enough to understand what it could still become, and stubborn enough to keep learning, failure after failure, until they finally get it right. Somewhere near you right now, there is probably something like those bales of wool, written off, overlooked, waiting on nothing more than someone willing to notice. If you've ever built something out of what everyone else gave up on, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more stories about ordinary people building something extraordinary out of what everyone else threw away.